October 29th, 2021. I am writing this only a few hours after everything has happened. Now that I've calmed down and the sun is coming up, I feel somewhat safer. Last night I was lying in bed, doing some reading before I went to sleep. I feel that it's important to clarify that I live on the outskirts of my town. Still technically in town, but definitely on the edge. I live off the highway that leads into about a 15-mile long stretch of country. Woods, fields, and a few residents, but mostly open highway. So aside from the other tenants in my actual apartment building, it's normally pretty quiet in my area. My building is square with 4 apartments. All of our doors simply face outside. There is no lobby or common area of any kind. My door in particular looks out into a large field that goes uphill. I don't remember the exact time, probably somewhere between 1 and 2 a.m., when someone randomly began banging on my door, which freaks me out at the best of times in broad daylight, but especially in the dead of night. I nervously went to go ask who it was.
"It's the police. You need to let me in. Now."
Luckily, I watch and listen to a lot of true crime stuff, so I got suspicious real quick. He couldn't tell me why I had to let him in, and he never asked what my name was. He also didn't really sound like a cop, if you know what I mean. Obviously, I was feeling creeped out, so I called 911 to confirm that there was actually an officer at my address. They said there wasn't. At this point, I am full-blown having a panic attack, and I call out through the door that I'm on the phone with the actual police, and the guy just bangs on my door one more time, then stops making any kind of noise. I presume that he had just ran off. They dispatched 2 police cars to my apartment, and the officers took a good look around. Unfortunately, the perpetrator was long gone by this point, and I didn't see him, so I couldn't give a physical description of him or anything. But the cops said 2 things that made me feel better. 1, they would do more patrols in my area over the Halloween weekend, and 2, it was likely a Halloween prank, because the bar down the street from my apartment had a party and had just closed not long before this happened. Always trust your instincts, and remember that if you have any doubts about someone claiming to be a police officer, call 911 and confirm that they really are. Both the dispatch and the officers who came to my apartment told me that you're not going to get into any trouble for verifying that you're talking with an actual police officer. This also applies to situations where it's nighttime, so you can't really see if it's a real cop car behind you or not. If you see flashing lights behind you on a back road or in a dark area, put on your hazard lights and call the local police department to make sure it's actually a police car. Better safe than sorry. Anyways, I hope that anonymous man at my door was merely a drunken Halloween prankster and not somebody who had any sinister intentions. Update: November 17th, 2021. I'm going to address a few things because I keep getting comments and messages about them. I'm still fine, by the way, and the incident hasn't reoccurred, but I agree with the sentiment that this wasn't a prank, but someone with malicious intent. It seems that the police were able to scare him off, or they moved on elsewhere. I've also purchased and installed a doorbell camera, as well as an exterior camera that's hidden, so that I won't be caught unaware again. I was born in London, England, to a Russian mother and a Ukrainian stepfather. My mother had me when she was very young and struggled with an alcohol and drug addiction. My stepfather used to be very kind to me, but grew cold toward me after my half-sister was born when I was around 9. Soon after she was born, my family was invited by my uncle to visit a beautiful island in Indonesia called Bali. He told us it was a tropical paradise where even the rain was warm. It would definitely be a change from the gloomy winter months of England. It was the holiday season, so I had no primary school to attend, and my mother was more than happy to accept my uncle's invitation, so we planned for a 2-week trip, packing lightly. Everything from the 27-hour-long flight to the drive to our accommodation in Bali went smoothly. My uncle wasn't lying. The rain really was warm here. The air was fresh, and the sights were breathtaking, no matter where you looked. Because of Bali's Hindu culture, the streets constantly smelt of incense, and each street corner had a small dedicated temple with offerings of fresh fruit, flower petals, and rice. I'm sure this all caused us to let our guards down. I don't recall who it was that my mother had befriended, but it was another Russian family who had a daughter 3 years older than I. We were invited to dinner at their place in Ubid, a large village often called the Heart of Bali, due to its artistic reputation. On the drive there, I remember how we were going to a more isolated area of the busy village. There were a few lights, and only a couple of homes that we passed. It seemed to become much more darker as we approached our destination. Just before we pulled into our host's driveway, I looked out the open window and saw a group of traditionally dressed men playing a card game under a dim light. One of the men in particular made me retreat back into my car seat. He looked me in the eyes as we passed, with a gaze that locked onto me for far too long, which made me uncomfortable. Looking back in hindsight, I think that was when I was chosen. Even with the ignorance of a child, I still felt uneasy from his gaze that lingered on me for far too long. Despite this unnerving experience, our hosts were very lovely people. They rented a house that was next to a rice paddy field, which was surrounded by a jungle, giving full privacy to the home. From the few days I had spent in Bali already, I learned that having houses with loose gates and having thin doors made of bamboo or glass was normal here, something that I was definitely not used to back in London. I assumed it was just because of the heat and trustworthiness among the locals. Once I became tired, I was sent to sleep in a spare bedroom, while my family stayed in a guest cabin just outside. The room that I was staying in was made of glass. The walls were covered in thick curtains for privacy, and the door was left unlocked, as I came to find out later on that night. I was wearing a white night shirt and a pair of underwear. This will be relevant later on. At first, I thought I was dreaming when I woke up to a man whispering in my ear. I had a history with sleep paralysis before, and I thought that I would just go back to sleep. But then, I started to question things around me. Why was the light on? Was it daytime already? No, couldn't be. The glass walls showed it was still dark outside. I didn't feel any covers on my body, and as I regained my senses, I realized I was no longer wearing underwear. My innocent mind dismissed it as my own fault. I then turned to see an unfamiliar man lying next to me. My mind went straight to panic mode. I was now fully awake and could comprehend his words. "Come with me. Be quiet. Please don't scream." The man was dressed in all black, and he had black, slicked-back hair. He looked to be about middle-aged and overweight. I will never forget his face and how he looked at me with eyes full of lust. I was still too young to understand what a pedophile was. All I knew was that this man wanted to hurt me, and I had to get away. The intruder eventually lost his patience with me and pulled out a large knife from his belt. I instantly did what he told me to do. To this day, I don't know why I didn't cry. I was still probably hoping it was just a dream, but I walked out of the room with my kidnapper. He was gripping my arm so tightly, it bruised. As we passed by the cabin my family should have been sleeping in, I screamed my mom's name once we got outside of their door. He tried covering my mouth, hissing threats of stabbing me in my throat. I screamed louder, but no one came. For some reason, at that moment, I thought that he had killed my entire family. It was the only reason that they wouldn't have come. I would later learn that my baby sister had caused my mother and stepfather to drive back to our original hotel room, but I didn't know that at the time. I really thought that they were dead, and it made me lose what little fight I had in me. He started to drag me further away from the house, through the bushes and into the jungle. He was wearing boots while I was still barefoot. I'm not sure how long he pulled me for, but I eventually found the courage to try fighting him off. I wanted to see my family. I didn't even think of myself. I wanted to see my baby sister, and the thought of anything happening to her filled me with anger. I tried kicking him in his balls, since that's what I learned in primary school if I wanted to hurt boys, but I was too weak, and he threw me to the ground, breaking a few bones in the process. I tried grabbing at his knife, but in the dark, I couldn't see very well. He ended up carrying me on his back for the rest of the way, taking me deeper into the jungle. Bali's wildlife at night was so deafening that if anyone was around, they probably wouldn't have heard me over all the noise the frogs and bugs were making. At this point, I was exhausted. I could no longer scream. I couldn't fight anymore. I could barely move. Once we arrived, I noticed that the place my kidnapper had taken me to was some abandoned shack in the middle of the jungle. I had no idea how long it had taken to get there, but it was still dark out. What happened to me once we got there, I'll never be able to fully articulate, but I think everyone listening knows what happened. I don't remember how long I was in there for, and we aren't talking hours. It was weeks. He would leave me alone to recover during the day, and come back at night, leaving me scraps of food before he left. All I could think about the entire time I was in there was how I was going to die here in this torture shack. What began as a pleasant vacation had turned into the worst experience of my life. I lost faith and felt nothing but hatred for any higher beings that were meant to protect me. I hated my parents for not being there. I hated myself for being too weak to run away. Somehow, this outpouring of emotion gave me the strength to escape. I broke out of the shed and limped, then crawled to the nearest rice field. I was thinking clearly once again. I would survive this nightmare out of pure spite. Soon, I was discovered by a local rice farmer. At first, I was terrified of him. He had a scythe he was using to clear some overgrowth. The trauma that I had just experienced caused me to react with pure fear. He managed to calm me down, and although he couldn't speak English very well, I could see that he didn't have any ill intent. I let him carry me to the local village, which happened to be near where I was taken from. I lost my mind after I looked at myself in the mirror before being taken to the hospital. Most of my teeth were gone. My hair was patchy and falling off. My appearance horrified me. I had to have several reconstructive surgeries done to repair the broken bones that hadn't healed properly. The next year and a half is a blur for me. I find it strange that I can recall my kidnapping, but not the aftermath. Unfortunately, the man responsible for my kidnapping was never caught in time. By the time he was arrested, he had killed a 14-year-old girl. There were many other victims before me, but as the lone survivor, they were able to get enough DNA from me to have him locked up for good. But all those girls this monster murdered, and how I was almost one of them, is something that I still live with to this day. 12 years have gone by, and everyone has forgotten about them. but I never will. I know exactly what it was like for them. The trial left my family broken. We had to move to Bali temporarily. I'm not sure of all the details, but we couldn't afford to keep our house in England anymore. My stepfather ended up leaving, and my mother began to despise me for being a problematic child. After 4 years, we moved back to the UK, and I was almost instantly taken away by the foster care system. My mother had disowned me for dirtying the family blood. She had become vile and horrifically abusive to me over the years after my kidnapping. She couldn't handle what happened and was consumed by guilt. Nowadays, I'm doing much better. I still keep in contact with my younger sister, and I support her in any way I can. I graduated from college with a degree in criminology, hoping to catch more of these bastards out there in the world. I decided that I would put my trauma to use, but it wasn't easy getting to this point. I spent most of my teenage years in and out of hospitals and getting into trouble, but I ended up making some very good friends who supported me through that tough time in my life. To the survivors out there, you may seem strange to others because of your trauma, but you can't live through hell and come out the other side perfect and normal. That is not how life works. But as they say, what doesn't kill you can make you stronger. On that note, stay safe, lock your doors, and keep your children close. Thanks for listening. And if you're curious, I will link an article that was written about my experience. This happened when I was 7 years old. I was a very strange child. I did not enjoy playing with toys. I spent most of my time exploring the rather large woods that were behind my house. I guess my guardian, we'll call him John, had a lot of trust in me even then, because I was often allowed to go by myself, and a lot of the time, this was at night. My bedroom at the time was in the attic of our cottage. It was small and cozy, and it had a large circular window that looks out over the forest. There was a window box underneath it, and I would sit there for hours and watch the sun go down behind the trees. If I opened the window wide enough, I would be able to climb out onto the kitchen roof, and there was a small tool shed below that I could easily slide down onto and jump into the bushes. That's usually how I got out at night in order to go exploring in the forest. I know it was a stupid thing for a 7-year-old to be doing, but I was a fearless child, and I had a small mobile phone that I carried with me in case of emergency or if I ever got lost. I was on my way out one night. I had just climbed onto the kitchen roof when I noticed a small light flashing from the tree line. I stopped moving and tried to pinpoint where it came from, but I couldn't really see anything. So I assumed that I had just seen an outdoor light reflecting on one of the many wind chimes that were hung up around the trees, and I continued on my way. I reached the ground and had taken a few steps forward when I heard a faint sound coming from the trees. I held my breath, as I did when I was trying to hear better. I had been standing there for about a minute when I heard what can only be described as a laugh. I called out and asked if anyone was there. I didn't expect a reply, but that's exactly what I got. It sounded like an old woman's voice. I don't remember her exact words, but it was something like,
"Hello, little girl. I see you."
There was another quick flash. I turned and climbed back up onto the kitchen roof as fast as I could, but for some reason, I didn't go back inside the house. I guess I was just curious. I had a small pocket flashlight that I kept on the window box. I grabbed it and shined it around the garden. That's when I saw her. The woman was definitely old. In fact, she looked like a corpse. It was almost as if she hadn't eaten in a while. I remember feeling slightly afraid because she was looking directly at me. She was wearing a white nightdress, and she seemed to be swaying side to side, almost like a patient in an insane asylum. She then began whistling, The Man Who Sold the World. And honestly, that song still freaks me out to this day. It's like an omen, because strange things seem to happen to me whenever I hear it. Before crawling back into my bedroom, I remember noticing a camera in her hands. I know after I went back inside, she stayed for a while longer, because I saw a few more flashes outside before I fell asleep. Needless to say, I locked my window at night, and though this incident did not stop me from going back out, this encounter definitely made me more aware whenever I did. It's been 13 years, and I haven't seen that woman since. When I was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in southern Mississippi, about an hour and a half west of Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field surrounded by forest. This was about 5 miles from a paved road. To get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was south of the house. About a quarter-mile north was a lake. It was about as long as a football field, but wider. To get there, you could take Route A, which was a hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees, which is why we called it Dogwood Lane. Route B was about 100 yards east of Dogwood Lane, and we named it Vampire Trail, because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun on the brightest of days, and it had a slight decline as you walked toward the lake. One morning during the fall, my parents and my little sister had gone to get ice cream and to do some shopping. This trip would take them at least an hour or two, and I was 10 years old. So I decided to go fishing while listening to Bama take on Ole Miss, college football. The game was the usual Bama win, so I thought I could ease the boredom of a blowout by fishing in the lake. So I carried my pole, a small radio, and my ice chest. I had an Airedale Terrier named Bully that never left my side, and it was on this day that I realized just how awesome he really was. I took a Vampire Trail and settled on the small pier at the end of the path. About 5 minutes after I threw out my line and 2 Bama touchdowns later, I got that feeling. It's a feeling I've come to recognize well, and it might have saved my life that day. It was the feeling that I was being watched by something dangerous. Bully must have felt it too, because a few seconds later, I could hear him growling and staring across a lake to the west toward Dogwood Lane. I turned my head in that direction, and almost immediately, my eyes lit up when I saw what looked to be a silhouette of a large man hiding behind a tree. It was too far off to make out any details, but close enough to be sure of what I was seeing. Almost 5 minutes went by, and right before I scolded myself for having an overactive imagination, the figure slowly moved behind a tree. Bully stood and growled louder. I told him to quietly stop, and I kept my eyes rooted on that tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while this figure moved slowly from tree to tree. Scared stiff was something I found to be true at that moment. For some reason, I thought it was important that whoever or whatever it was didn't know that I was aware of it. I finally realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to me. My paralysis broke, and I casually put down the fishing pole and started walking back towards Vampire Trail. As an adult, I was in the Army for 11 years as an MP, but not turning back to look over my shoulder that day was the hardest thing I've ever done. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a sprint. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me and stopped some 20 yards ahead, facing me, until I would pass him. He continued this the entire way home. My dog was watching my back. Although I can grasp how epic this was now, at the time I was so scared, I was literally sick. Even at a young age, I knew that a large man trying to creep up on a 10-year-old boy was up to no good. When I got back to the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got one of my dad's shotguns, as well as his .38 revolver. I sat in front of the large window, my eyes glued to both of the trail openings. I never felt safe there again. When my friends and I, or my younger sister, wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure that my parents were with us. What scares me the most, though, is the fact that our closest neighbors were about 2 miles northwest of us, with thick woods in between. Had something happened, no one would have came to help. I still wonder who the hell was watching me from the woods that day. I guess I'll never know. I sometimes wish I could go back there, as a grown man with military training. Bully lived a full life, and passed away peacefully when he was very old. He was the best dog I have ever known. This happened to me about 3 months ago. A bit of background about myself. I suffer from chronic pain from a back injury that has been operated on 3 times. Most of the time I deal with it and live my life, but every few years it really gets to me. I go into these bad states of depression, and I stop talking to my family, and generally turn into a hermit. When this happens, my family gets very worried that I'm going to hurt myself. I have no idea why. I have never made an attempt or even said that I was planning to. They send me to a psych ER, at which point they usually put me on a 5150. For those who don't know, that means a 3-day hold. They send me off to the local psych ward. None of this has really bothered me before. I have good insurance, so the place they send me is basically like a hotel where you can't have shoelaces. When they wheel you in is the worst part. And if you're admitted in the middle of the day like I was, you're wheeled right through the day room, where all the other patients stare at you coming in. This might be a good time to describe myself. I'm a male, just a bit over 6'2", around 285 pounds, with tattoos covering both arms. And since I have been depressed for months, my beard and hair were out of control at this point, and I looked like a generic biker. So generally I don't ever have a problem with people trying to mess with me. I'm a very friendly guy, but unless you know me, I don't look like it. As I have been through this a couple of times before, I know the gist of what's going to happen. They take all my info, make sure that I have no laces or anything with strings, and they then show me to my room. This psych ward is co-ed, but roommates can only be the same sex. It's also low security, meaning everyone in here is supposedly non-violent. My only problem with this place is that they have people like me with no history of mental illness who are just going through a hard time, mixed in with all different levels of patients. But in the last 2 visits here, I've never had a problem with anyone, and I was hoping that I would just do my 3 days and be done. They send me to my room, and the nurse says that my roommate's name is Tim. She also starts to say something along the lines of, Tim's a really nice guy. Which of course made me a bit weary. But we're in a psych ward. Everyone in here has some issues. These rooms are basically like any crappy motel, except maybe a bit bigger. There's 2 beds, a bathroom, which annoyingly doesn't have a full door, 1 desk, and each patient gets their own dresser. It's 3 p.m., and Tim is sound asleep, which isn't that weird, since everyone is on different medications that knock them out or make them just have weird sleep habits. So I don't think anything of it. As a matter of fact, after spending hours in the ER, and a couple more getting all signed in, I'm dead tired myself, and I decided to fall asleep, which I do almost instantly. I have no idea how long I slept for, but when I wake up, it's pitch black outside, and only the small floor light that you can't turn off is giving the room some illumination. Tim is wide awake and sitting up on his bed. Psst. What's up, man? I'm Brian. I would have said hi earlier, but you were sleeping. Didn't they say his name was Tim? I was trying to be as friendly as possible, since it's just easier to get along with everyone in places like this. Yeah, earlier I was a bit tired too. I try to sleep as much as possible so I don't have to interact with any of the demons. This should have been a giant red flag, and my cue to ask for a different room. But Tim was much smaller than me, and they search you when you first come in, so I had no reason to fear him, and I decided to make conversation with him about these demons, which I found out to him were all the nurses and doctors. After talking to him about this, I told him that I was still very tired and needed some more sleep. Okay, and it's really nice to finally have a fellow human as a roommate. I took this as a sign that he was okay with me, and that I didn't have to sleep with one eye open. I woke up early the next morning for breakfast, since I hadn't eaten in 24 hours. After I sit down, Tim comes out and sits next to me. Aside from referring to the nurses and doctors as demons, he seemed pretty normal. We chatted about normal things for a while, until he suddenly stops talking and begins staring at someone behind me. You see her? That's Jessica. She's an angel. I turned around to see a very attractive girl who looked to be in her early 20s, maybe even 18 or 19. She waves and says hello to Tim and everyone else who was sitting in the dining room area. She was one of those social butterflies who goes out of their way to be super nice to everyone. When I looked back, I noticed that he was staring at her a bit too much, and I snapped my fingers. Hey man, don't freak her out. He gave me a very confused look, like I had said the most absurd thing in the world to him, and he got very quiet after that. Honestly, I didn't think much of it, as I had my own shit to deal with. The rest of the day was the usual. In a place like this, you have to go to meetings, talk to your doctor, take your medication, but the majority of the time you're just bored out of your mind. The TV gets like 4 channels. Even if one of them was HBO, it was hit or miss. So I spent the majority of the time reading books in the day room. While I'm reading a book, Jessica comes up to me, introduces herself, and begins asking me all kinds of questions about my tattoos while I'm reading. The story of my life. Like me, she was basically a normal person having a hard time. She just had bad anxiety problems that caused her to have panic attacks, mainly since she had just started college, and couldn't really deal with the pressure too well. We ended up talking for a couple of hours, and I didn't even think about it until after. But Tim was walking past us over and over. A lot of people did laps in this place to pass the time, so I didn't really think much of it. I later learned he was basically staring a hole through the back of my head the entire time. After talking to Jessica for a while, I tell her that I'm going to go take a shower before dinner, and we'll catch up later. As I said before, the bathrooms in this place only have half doors. Picture those old Western saloon doors. So when I'm done, I can see Tim's legs under the door. What's up, man? Do you need to use the bathroom? I'll be just a minute. I gotta change. He doesn't say anything, and just stands there. You're starting to freak me out a bit. I can hear him breathing heavy, and these doors don't lock, so he could have just pushed it open if he wanted to. Dude, you need to back up, because I need to get out. He then begins shouting at me, "You're Satan! You're Lucifer!" Over and over. I am now full-blown freaking out at this point. If I open the door and beat the shit out of this guy, it's going to be me who gets shot in the ass and put into the quiet room. But I don't know what else to do. Even though he's screaming as loud as he can, no nurses seem to be coming out. The doors to the bedroom in this place are very thick. I'm pretty sure it's because if some of the patients scream in the night, they don't want the other patients being woken up. Which is a pretty nice policy, but it put me into a bind at the moment. After what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 1, he stops and leaves the room. I get dressed, and instantly go find a nurse to tell them what just happened. I have no idea what they said to him, but they immediately put me into a different room. I don't see him at all for the rest of the night, but I'm legit freaked out. No one has ever screamed at me or cornered me like that before, and I couldn't sleep at all that night. Since they don't have clocks, I have no idea what time it is when I hear him from the day room, where the nurse's station is. "Where is he? Why isn't he coming back to sleep?" It was the same tone he was using when he was screaming at me in the bathroom. I cracked the door just a bit, so I could hear the nurse talking to him. "You'll see him in the daytime, and you can talk to him then. Now go back to bed." "But I have to see him tonight. It's an emergency." This goes on for another 30 seconds, before security finally gets there, and I hear a scuffle. But there was no way in hell I was going out there to see what was going on. I can still hear him yelling, but I couldn't make out what he was saying, and it eventually starts to fade. I figure that he was escorted to the quiet room, which was on the opposite side of the ward. Needless to say, even with him in the quiet room, I laid awake the entire night. Morning came, and my doctor is already there, which I found very strange. I usually only saw him well after dinner time. He calls me into the interview room to talk to me. He basically asks me about all the interactions I've had with Tim. I go over everything. When I was done, he tells me that I no longer have to worry about Tim, because he's been transferred to a different hospital. I have lived around here my entire life, so I actually knew about the hospital he was sent to, and it's pretty hardcore. It's the kind of place where they lock you into a room most of the day. I felt kind of bad, because I knew he thought I was trying to steal his angel, and was just angry with me over a misunderstanding. But whatever. It's also nice to know that I'm not going to have to hit some poor guy in the face for creeping me the hell out. I finished my stay, and I actually felt a lot better about everything. My pain is being managed better, and I'm ready to stop being such a hermit. My grandmother comes and picks me up, and I think that we're ready to leave. But the doctor is there again very early, and my grandmother is giving me a look that has me a bit worried. I thought that they were going to make me stay longer. Once again, I was brought to the interview room. This is where they tell me what really happened that night, which they didn't want me knowing until I completed my treatment. That night, Tim came out over and over again, asking the nurse when I was coming back. The nurse just kept telling him that he would see me in the morning, and did not tell him that I had switched rooms. Apparently this went on for hours, before he finally started screaming about it. Security came and he was moved to the quiet room, and given a shot to incapacitate him. The nurse got in touch with Tim's doctor and told him about the situation. Tim's doctor suggested that he be moved to the medium security wing upstairs until I left. When they went to gather Tim's belongings, they found a 7-inch piece of metal that he had broke off from a table in the TV room. That room has cameras and also has windows where you can see the nurse's station. So my guess is he waited until they weren't looking and worked on it until he broke it off. I'm 99.99% certain that me asking to change rooms is what saved me from being stabbed to death while I was sleeping. The doctors agreed, which is why he was sent to that other hospital. Since he never actually attacked me, he wasn't charged with a crime, and I have no idea how long he was held for, but I'll be a happy man if I never run into him ever again. This is something that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. Now, for some context, I lived in the middle of nowhere, Canada. It was an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to the absence of residents. Me and many of my friends were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so we would go exploring in these abandoned buildings. Prior to this experience, nothing too crazy has ever happened to us. Occasionally we would see a small amount of liquid that looked like blood and a pentagram on the ground, left by someone who was there previously, but nothing too out of the ordinary. That was until the last time I went exploring. When I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part of a mental hospital. It was a weird combination. It closed down due to a lack of patients and the lack of children at the daycare. I decided to go back there with my friends a few years ago. I was 15 when this happened. and most of my friends were around the same age. When we got there, it was rather cliché. There was a fog, it was dark, and there was a light drizzle. We went to the main gate, which was locked shut. We decided to help each other hop over, making a ton of noise. We were laughing the entire time, completely oblivious of what was to come. We looked around the small play area with flashlights, but even with our flashlights, our visibility was rather limited. We decided to enter the decaying building. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos, wood chips, torn dolls, and toys strewn about. The further we went into the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent, until all we could hear was the sound of the dirt crunching under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to pick them up, when all of a sudden, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door which led to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I all looked at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of us were very bold and cocky. My friend Brian then suggested that we go look to see where the sound came from. Personally, I was not too fond of that idea, but with my group of friends, there was no way I was going to decline. We all stacked up on the door and opened it. It was rusted to the floor, and we had to heave to get it open. The metallic smells and must became stronger, with a hint of something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. We walked in, our flashlights pointed in every direction, with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight, and there were metal doorways to our left and right. Some of them were open. I felt slightly claustrophobic, and it was becoming difficult for me to breathe. As we continued, Brian shined his flashlight into a room, then recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered that room.
"What is it?"
I asked him.
"I thought I saw someone in here, but I guess it was just my imagination."
To be honest, I thought he was messing with us to increase our anxiety, but looking back now, I think he was being completely honest. He backed out of the room, and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward. Another friend in the group told us to stop. We all came to a halt and listened. In the distance ahead of us, we heard the sound of subtle footsteps echoing through the hallway. We all looked at each other, fear in our eyes. Brian continued walking toward the sounds. The rest of us considered turning back, wondering if it was a ghost or something else in the building with us. But we couldn't just leave Brian behind. The closer we got, the more I felt I was in danger. We finally entered a room on the right, which smelled of rotting meat. In front of us was a eviscerated deer carcass. Its innards were all over the floor, staining the concrete. One of my friends, who had a very weak stomach, instantly vomited all over the floor. That's when we heard whispering from somewhere nearby. Brian shined his flashlight to the corner of the room, where a man with short hair was standing with his head down. He wore a bright green shirt, stained with what I assumed was blood. He didn't have any socks or shoes on his exposed, damaged feet. The man was twitching sporadically. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first move. He looked up at us with a haunting grin that sent shivers down my spine.
"You guys here for the feast?"
he asked. This kicked us all over the edge, and we bolted out of that room all the way back to the daycare center. The door was still open, and we decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and the heaviness of the door almost kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all of our strength to close it. Just before we did, I could see the silhouette of the man watching us from down the hall, his white teeth being the only feature that I could see. As we sat behind the door, catching our breath, we looked at each other for confirmation that we all saw the same thing. After a while of labored breathing, we heard a light tapping on the door. That's when we decided it was time to go. We booked it out of there and ran back home. A year after we visited that spot, the police went there to do a routine check of the area, and they found that man. It was stated that this person used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He escaped the facility that he was transferred to and lived off of the wildlife around the complex. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sickness from eating raw meat. His mental condition was much worse than before. There were other rumors that he killed somebody in the forest while searching for food. So if you're going to go exploring in abandoned buildings, don't forget my story, and always be on your guard. The event in question happened during my sophomore year in college, back in 2012. I honestly can't remember the exact month, but I believe it was sometime during the winter. At the time I lived with two roommates, Katie and Danielle, and we were the best buds of all time. We had just moved into our first off-campus house, and we were reveling in the freedom of being out of the dorms. With this turn of events came some experimentation with drugs and alcohol. The three of us began hanging out and partying with a group of people who eventually got into harder drugs, like cocaine and Molly, etc. Katie and I decided after a while that all of this partying was jeopardizing our health and our schoolwork, so we backed off on the drugs. Danielle, however, decided to continue experimenting and became more aggressive. I should note that I hold no judgment toward drug use whatsoever, but I include it because I believe it may be a crucial component of the events that followed. The saga started on a weekend. We all decided to go to a party one night and got separated from each other. I had made arrangements to leave the party early, so Danielle agreed to walk with Caddy back to the house. We were always adamant about the buddy system at night. However, on that night, it failed. Danielle left the party with someone, leaving Katie to walk home by herself. She was unfortunately followed by a strange man. To this day, I deeply regret leaving that night, but I've come to terms with my past decision. I came home the next morning. Katie filled me in on the previous night. She was very upset, which was out of character for her. She told me that she had texted Danielle at some point during the night, telling her that she was very bummed out about having to walk home alone. Katie was frustrated, and her text was blunt, but Katie and I just figured that Danielle would either brush it off or apologize, and things would move on. That did not happen. Danielle flipped her shit and became completely enraged. She responded very defensively and told Katie, in very colorful terms, to basically fuck off and get over it. We thought it was pretty odd and hostile, but trying to just carry on with our lives and not overthink it. It was a Monday, so Katie left the house to go to work on campus, and I went to my afternoon lecture. Sometime while I was in class, Danielle came into Katie's workplace in the student rec center and began screaming at her in front of 60+ patrons, calling her all kinds of obscenities. She was escorted out of the building by security and somehow made her way back to our house. I should also note that Danielle's mother was visiting this week and was with her the entire time. I believe she was terrified of her daughter, which is why she never intervened. By the time she arrived at home, I had returned from class and was making food in the kitchen. At this juncture, Danielle's rage was centered on Katie, not me. I tried to let the two of them work it out without my intervention, but Danielle cornered me in the kitchen and told me how angry she was with Katie. I have never seen rage in someone's eyes like that. I refused to engage with her and retreated to my room in the back of the house. I sat on my bed and took some deep breaths. That's when I heard Katie coming up the side yard. She was crying on the phone with her mom, telling her what had just taken place at work. I immediately felt this horrible pit in my stomach, as I knew they were about to confront each other again. The door opened, and Katie walked in. I was still in my room when I heard them start yelling at each other. Katie stood up for herself, telling Danielle that she was way out of line, and Danny retorted with more obscenities. The yelling turned into full-on screaming, and I had finally had enough. So I went into the living room where they were arguing. Danielle's mom was there as well. I told Danny to knock it off and leave, to which she told me to go fuck myself. This gave Katie time to try to bolt into her room, but Danny followed her and slammed Katie's hand in the door as she was trying to barricade herself. Things had gotten way out of hand. I went outside on our front porch, and Katie followed me outside. A few seconds later, we heard Danny's mom screaming for her to put something down. We looked at each other in terror. I told Katie to run away and to call 911. At that moment, Danny flings open the front door, holding a giant kitchen knife raised above her head, and screaming at the top of her lungs at Katie, saying that she was going to kill her. By this time, all of our neighbors were standing outside, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I'm not a very confrontational person, but like hell was I going to let someone kill my best friend. So in a split-second decision, I lunged at Danny and somehow managed to get the knife away from her and threw it on the front lawn. I ran to grab it, at which time Danielle had gone back inside to grab another knife. This time, she turned it on herself and asked me if I wanted to watch her end it all. Something had gone terribly wrong with Danielle. Her mother was hysterical by this point, and I kept pleading for her to stop. I then blacked out. When I came to, I was running down the street with Katie. We soon took refuge at a neighbor's house. All the while we could still hear Danielle's blood-curdling screams down the street. We were totally shell-shocked, but grateful to our neighbors for helping us out until the police came. We saw the cops show up a short time later, along with a crisis unit. They detained Danny and drove her to the hospital, where she was put on a psychiatric evaluation. Katie and I never saw Danielle again, and we stayed with some mutual friends for a couple of weeks before returning to that house. We moved out at the end of that year, as the place harbored too many bad memories for us. I later learned that Danielle had experienced a psychotic break triggered by a variety of factors, including stress, drug use, and an underlying mental health condition. This was a huge eye-opener for me to further educate myself about mental health in young adults, as well as appreciate the incredible things your body can do while you're in fight or flight mode. It's also taught me a lesson to trust my gut more, as my spidey senses had warned me about Danielle before, but I ignored it. This is somewhat of a convoluted story, so please bear with me as I try to convey everything that I can recall about what led me to the conclusion that my former housemate could have potentially been a serial killer, or one in the making. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first appearances my housemate Mike was somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd. But I really needed a place to stay, and everyone has their little quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike more, I learned about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He is probably the first person I knew who used meth and balanced a full-time job and enjoyed a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house, drinking and using, he would start to run off at the mouth, joking that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, to not think anything of it. It was probably the third time he said this that I asked him why he kept saying that. He responds with, "I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies," with a creepy grin on his face. I tried to chalk it up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know about my coming and going and my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I ended up taking off of work because he didn't realize that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house or his bedroom. On other days, he would play very loud music that bumped through the entire house. Sometimes he would even play NPR talk radio at very high volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers, saying, "You can do whatever you want. You can choke them or beat them to death, and nobody cares." I took exception to this, telling him that I thought that was messed up. When he would get to tweaking, he would always come back around to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about he was a normal guy who owned a house and had a good career, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I think he has gone too far to simply be joking. I was in a weird position. Money was tight at the time, and I didn't have very many options. I tried to convince myself that even if he was messed up, he probably was just engaging in some outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, I don't judge that kind of activity at face value. But I was becoming concerned. One day when I was doing laundry, I caught a whiff of decomposition. The house we were in was in southeast Portland and was relatively new. Having grown up in upstate New York, I know that animals can sometimes be trapped in the walls and die. But this was in the garage. There were no animals scurrying about. This was both strange and telling to me. I considered carefully what to do and decided that I would confront him about the smell. I decided to pose the question in a somewhat suggestive way by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needs to do a better job of cleaning up the bodies because I could smell the decomposition from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened and he shot me a sharp glare, somewhere between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded with, "What? Really?" "Yeah, really." There was a few seconds of awkward silence before he said, "Thanks for letting me know." He then promptly went to his bedroom and closed the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage while I was doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up to the crawl space. My body locked up. My instincts were screaming at me that if I went up there, I would not come back down. I gave him some excuse about having to go somewhere, packed up my laundry, threw it in my room, and quickly left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way inside was through the backyard. I wish I would have gone down there in retrospect to either confirm or dismiss my suspicions once and for all. In the last couple of months of living there, I was subjected to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was also using more and more. He once showed me a video he made, which featured heavy bondage themes interspersed with sounds of distorted screaming. and this strange, leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of those things by themselves may be innocuous, but as they accumulated together, they became a disturbing piece of art. It was October of 2016 that I finally left there, taking off to a Native American reservation for a pipeline protest. There were mixed feelings of a call to action and wanting to get out of that house any way I could. I gave him notice that I was leaving. My last night there, he was drinking and tweaking again, and eventually started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. "You know they're gonna catch you eventually," I said, not holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person that the police would ever suspect, and asserted that they would never catch him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense altogether. I left the next morning. This haunted me for months, then a year, then a year and a half. It felt as though I hadn't done anything, and the guilt was eating away at me. So I called the Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold, because the phone call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant who was assigned to the call center. So they were asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, the house, the methods he described, etc. It seemed like they had taken an interest. I gave them as much information as I could, and left it at that, feeling just a bit better that I at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times. I told my mother all about this, and she became very interested, asking what house this was, and she ended up pulling it up on Google Maps and put it up on Street View. I noticed that there was a large enclosed trailer sitting in the driveway that wasn't there before. I could provide a few theories as to why it might be there, but cannot put together a practical reason for it. Admittedly, this is pure conjecture, but I can't help but wonder. I doubt that I will ever get closure, or have my suspicions validated, unless he finally gets caught and arrested. I have interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my life, but none of them have ever left this kind of impression on me. Make of this what you will, but I hope I never see him again. This happened over the course of a year, when I was between 15 and 16. I'm 20 years old now, and it's only been recently revealed to me just how messed up the situation really was. I was obviously still living at home at the time, but my sister, who is 7 years older than me, had moved out and was living with her now husband, his high school best friend, and some other guy who they met through one of those find a roommate sites. He was kind of the reclusive, nerdy type, who preferred hiding in his room watching Star Trek and playing computer games, rather than hanging out with the other roommates. And the only person he ever really seemed to want to be around was his similarly shy and nerdy girlfriend. For a bit of context to the story, when this happened he was 28 and she was 24. They were both a bit weird, but initially seemed entirely harmless. For the sake of the story, I'll refer to the normal roommate as Frank, the strange roommate as William, and his equally strange girlfriend as Amber. Now, my sister and I have never really had the best relationship with our parents, and at this point things were especially rocky. Our mother was dating a guy who was, to put it kindly, an abusive sack of shit who seemingly hated me and would find any excuse to go off on me. As a result, I spent a lot of time over at my sister's place. It was around this time that William and Amber started to get very strange. As I mentioned earlier, the two of them were always kind of odd. They only ever seemed to want to talk to each other, and would even go as far as to ignore anyone else who tried to speak to them. Amber was far worse than William in this regard. He would at least give you brief responses most of the time. Amber had a creepy habit of just blankly staring at you for a couple of seconds, then walking away if you asked her a question or tried to engage in conversation at all. That wasn't the strangest thing though. When I would stay over, I would sleep on a futon in Frank's office, which was on the ground floor. It happened to be next to the downstairs bathroom, which for some reason, Amber preferred using to the one upstairs. She would take long showers in the middle of the night, which was whatever. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, so I generally slept right through them. One night, however, I stayed up super late doing some revisions to my homework. I happened to be awake when she finished one of her late showers. I was too absorbed in my task to really pay attention to anything else, but I definitely noted hearing the shower shut off because it was an indicator of how late it really was. Approximately 10 minutes later, I look up from my laptop, and there she was. I always kept the door open just a crack, because that room tended to get unbearably hot if I didn't. Amber was just standing there, outside the room, completely naked, watching me through the open crack in the door. I said her name and asked if she was okay, which seemingly startled her, because she then walked away pretty quickly. I convinced myself that in my over-caffeinated, sleep-deprived state, I just imagined the whole thing, and I didn't mention it to anyone. Fast forward around a month later, I head over to my sister's place one night to find Frank a bit agitated about what he perceives to be a peeping Tom problem. He found fingerprints on the outside of his office window in such a way that it implied someone had been pressing up against the glass and looking in. The blinds in this room were slightly too small for the window, so you could see in from the outside, and the room was in the front of the house, with the window easily accessible from the street. He was concerned that some random passing pervert had been spying on him while he was having a private moment in his office, or some potential burglar had been sizing up the joint. The police were called, but since he didn't have any external CCTV at this point, no evidence could be provided, and ultimately, nothing could be done. Soon after, Frank installed both internal and external cameras on the house. This was installed while William and his girlfriend were away on holiday, and I guess everyone had forgotten to tell them about it. A couple of months later, I went to my sister's to find that William's room was empty and was informed that he had moved out. Of course, I asked why, and I was told that he and Amber were a pair of fucking creeps, and the others had collectively decided to kick them out. Apparently, Amber watching me through the office door was not a one-time incident. The security footage revealed that she did this frequently, sometimes for as long as 20 to 30 minutes. I was just usually asleep when she was doing it. Not only that, but the fingerprints on the window had apparently been from William standing outside watching me after I had showered and was hanging out in just a towel, which was a less regular occurrence, but apparently was caught on camera enough times for it to be concerning. As if this wasn't creepy enough, I was recently hanging out with my sister and her husband. He made a comment about how he wished they would have told me the entire story at the time, so that I could have pressed charges. I asked him what he meant by that, and he explained that not only had they been secretly watching me, but the footage also showed they had messed with food and stuff that I brought over, depicting William licking all of my apples and Amber spitting into my orange juice, even dumping regular cow's milk into my lactose-free stuff, which explains why I had a period of feeling sick out of nowhere. Apparently, when Frank barged into their room to confront them about it, he not only found several shirts I thought I had misplaced were stolen by them, but they literally hung them up on the wall, along with several drawings of me sleeping and poems about me, whose contents I don't know and really don't want to know. After seeing this, Frank gave them an ultimatum. You have 2 hours to get the fuck out of this house and never contact any of us again. or I'm calling the police. They took the former option, but I still feel sick thinking of what they were potentially planning for me. I'm a 17-year-old female, but this happened when I was 13. I was known as the quiet kid in school. I never said much in class, but since I was a paranoid person, I would always carry a weapon with me. I had a needle tool in my pencil case, but when I was outside of school, I would carry it in my pocket. It was used for making clay sculptures. If you don't know what it is, it's essentially a 2-inch metal spike with a wooden handle. In other words, it can be used as a shank. I went to a Catholic school on the outskirts of town, and every Friday or half day, most students would walk into town to go to Starbucks or Jerry's Post Road Market. I would usually grab a bag of chips and an Arizona iced tea from Jerry's. All the girls would walk together in one gigantic flock, but since I was a loner, I would always end up walking by myself. I had 2 other friends that I would usually go with, but they left that school a year earlier. The day this incident happened to me, it began like any other Friday. During dismissal, they would call all the walkers down in alphabetical order after the car riders and bussers were in their zones. After they dismissed the walkers, I went to the cafeteria bathroom to change out of my uniform. Since it was May and the weather was really warm, I brought a pair of shorts and a t-shirt to wear. I put the clay tool in my shorts pocket. After I was done changing, most of the walkers had already left the school. However, the walkers from the nearby high school, which my brother attended, had just been dismissed, and since there were usually a lot of them, they would be clogging the sidewalks. The route that I usually took to Jerry's was to walk all the way through town, which was maybe a mile long, but since it was so crowded, I decided that I would walk through a jogging trail in the woods that began behind a church. For the first couple of minutes, everything was fine. I saw a lot of rabbits, and even a family of deer in the woods. Eventually, I heard footsteps, followed by muffled laughter, coming from behind me. When I turned around, I saw a group of older boys from the high school. I knew them because they were friends with my brother, but he wasn't there that day. He was in Manhattan for my grandfather's 78th birthday. I couldn't go because I wasn't allowed to skip school. The first guy's name was Nick. He had long blonde hair and always wore a Beatles t-shirt. The second was Blake. He was a ginger who really liked screaming my name at the top of his lungs whenever he would see me in public. The last guy was John. He had light brown, messy hair and was known as the dangerous guy, who was always accepting dares, no matter how crazy. When they spotted me, Nick called out, "Eileen, you ready to have a bad day?" I began to pick up my pace. "Hey, don't walk away from us," I heard Nick say. They then began running towards me, so I turned around again. They had caught up to me and were now right behind me. Blake then blew into the buckle on his backpack, and it made this high-pitched whistling noise. He then said, "Be careful now. We all know what that noise means." I was confused, then asked, "What's that?" All 3 began laughing hysterically. "It's the rape whistle." They then pushed me down into the brook that ran along the path, getting my backpack all wet. That really made me mad, because now all my homework was soaked. So I picked up a rock from the ground and threw it at John, which hit him in the head. "Ah, you little bitch!" He then took off his backpack, jumped into the brook, and dunked my face into the freezing cold water. I was about to scream, but I then realized I would just be wasting the limited amount of oxygen I had. Then I remembered the clay tool was still in my pocket, so I grabbed it, managed to get away from John, and stabbed him in the hand as he was coming towards me again. He screamed and quickly grabbed his injured hand. I quickly got out of the brook, but then Blake and Nick pushed me against this giant willow tree and wrenched the clay tool out of my hand. As they had me pinned against the trunk, John climbed out of the brook and joined us. He then said, "You thought we were joking about the whistle, didn't you?" My heart skipped a beat. I began kicking and screaming, but no one could hear me because we were out of earshot of everyone on the street or the sidewalk. We then heard shouting coming from the end of the trail. Everyone looked up and saw two joggers, a couple in their mid-20s. Nick, John, and Blake ran from the scene, leaving their bags by the tree, while the two joggers ran up to me. I'll call them Mary and Joe. By the time they got to me, I was in the fetal position on the ground, bawling my eyes out. Mary comforted me while Joe called the police. Nick, John, and Blake were caught soon after. I don't know what happened to them. After this incident, I never walked into town alone again. Since I still prefer to be by myself, I trail behind the flock of girls whenever school lets out. My house is a 10-minute walk from town, and since one of my classmates is my neighbor, we would usually walk home together, so that I would never be alone. I want to sincerely thank those two joggers for saving me that day. The world could use more people like them. But to the 3 assholes who tried to have their way with me, you guys can go to hell.